Hi everyone, in this lesson we're going to be looking at more depth at the endocrine system. Specifically we're going to be looking at the hypothalamus, its functioning, and the pituitary gland. These are your learning objectives for this lesson. Please take the time to read over them and make sure that you understand them when it comes to studying and making your own notes. These are the key words that are associated with this lesson. Again, it's important that you are able to use these words appropriately when you're writing out exam questions. The word anterior is the correct anatomical word for the front. Posterior is anatomical for the back or behind. We're going to be talking quite a lot about the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and a stalk that connects the two, which is known as the infundibulum. That is a word that you are expected to know and you should be able to spell in your answers. We'll also be talking about how nerves and blood vessels are involved and releasing and inhibiting factors. So just to review what we already know about the endocrine system, we know that it is a collection of organs that have endocrine glands in them, and these glands will secrete specialized chemicals called hormones. Hormones are specialized because they only act on target cells or organs, and they initiate or bring about a change inside a cell or organ. Now, the endocrine system plays a very, very big role in maintaining homeostasis. The main way it does this is through a series of feedback systems, which are normally negative feedback. So just to give us some orientation of where we're looking at in the body, we're going to be looking at the central nervous system, specifically the area that we know as the brain. So we're looking at a sagittal section through the brain here. You can see this is the corpus callosum. That's the dividing bridge between the two hemispheres. This is one of the cerebral hemispheres. This is the cerebellum. And what we are looking at in this box here that you can see blown up in this image is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And this is the stalk that connects to the two of them, which you will remember is known as the infundibulum. All right, so let's talk more about these two structures. The hypothalamus, first of all, it doesn't just involve itself with endocrine functioning. It also regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, fatigue, and anger. But we're not going to look at those other functions just yet. The hypothalamus will connect to the nervous system. ANS stands for autonomic nervous system. So this is your subconscious level of nervous system. We'll talk more about that in the next topic. But it does connect the nervous system with the hormone or endocrine system. The hypothalamus itself produces hormones, and this is something that you need to make note of, and we'll discuss exactly what hormones it makes later on. And it also makes releasing factors and inhibiting factors, which will control the concentration and amount of hormone that is released from other organs. So it plays a very vital role within the body. If we look just below the hypothalamus, you have this stalk. Again, the name is the infundibulum. And then you have this organ, which is actually about the size of a small pea. And at the front lobe is known as the anterior pituitary gland because it's facing near the front of the brain. And you have the posterior pituitary gland, which is facing nearer the back of the brain. So the pituitary gland itself secretes, or another way of saying that is releasing hormones that can influence other endocrine glands. So we talked about this in the last lesson, and I gave you the example that the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary gland, can make and release growth hormone, which affects your body throughout your life, particularly as you're developing from a baby right through to your early 20s. Okay, again, this is just making sure that you're familiar with the anatomy of this. So we have the hypothalamus at the top here, this stalk-like structure called the infundibulum, the anterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland. If we cut through the middle here and expose what's inside, we can clearly see that there's a big difference between the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. You can actually see that if we trace it back to the hypothalamus, there's lots of nerve cell bodies in here, and these projections of the nerve cell bodies tend to go to the posterior of the pituitary gland. So straight away, that's something that you need to notice. The anterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, it contains endocrine cells, and this is surrounded by a network of capillaries. So we know that hormones travel in the bloodstream, and hormones are made in endocrine tissue. Therefore, this makes sense that you have endocrine cells surrounded by blood vessels. All right, so what I'd like you to do is just pause the video here and see if you can label these structures. Okay, so hopefully you had a go at labeling that. I'll go through that with you just now. Up here, this is the hypothalamus. These two structures are the nerve cell bodies, or neurons, I'd let you say that. This structure here is pointing to the stalk, which is the infundibulum. This is the anterior pituitary gland. This is the posterior pituitary gland, and of course, these two structures are blood capillaries. Hopefully you managed to label all of them. All right, so first of all, we're going to focus on the anterior pituitary gland, also known as the adenohypophysis. You don't really need to call it that name, although your textbook does mention it. Calling it the anterior pituitary gland and then abbreviating it to the APG is fine, but you must say the full thing first. So how this works is the hypothalamus will send out either a releasing factor or an inhibiting factor, but in this case we're looking at a releasing factor. This will be made in the cell body in the hypothalamus. This will travel down the axon fiber and through the infundibulum, and it will eventually communicate that information to release more hormone to the endocrine tissue in the anterior pituitary gland. Once that signal has been sent and the anterior pituitary gland secretes more of its hormone, it will then allow that hormone to be released into the bloodstream where it can go to its target organ. If we look at the posterior pituitary gland, also known as neurohypophysis, again, posterior pituitary gland is fine, and you can abbreviate that to PPG once you've written this out in full. You'll notice that this pathway is a lot more direct and it's a lot more simple. The hypothalamus makes hormones in this area, in the cell body of the axon, and the posterior pituitary gland simply stores that hormone in the axon terminals and releases it when required. And again, because it's a hormone, it will be released into the blood vessels, and that will be carried to the target organ. For the next little while, we're going to focus more on the anterior pituitary gland, or APG. You need to know the anatomy of it in basic terms, and you need to know which hormones are secreted from this part of the pituitary gland. So we've already said that the APG is sometimes known as adenohypophysis. Now, what we need to know is that the APG is connected to the hypothalamus by blood vessels, and you can see these up here. The APG itself secretes, which means it gives out and releases many hormones. And the ones that you need to know about are thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, collectively known as gonadotrophins because they target the gonads, growth hormone, prolactin, and there's another group of hormones which we don't really concern ourselves with, which are endorphins. How much or how little of these hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland is completely driven by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus neurosecretory cells, will secrete releasing factors, which will encourage the APG to secrete more hormone, or it will secrete inhibiting factors. So the hypothalamus secreting inhibiting factors will discourage or prevent the APG from secreting too much hormone. And this is part of how the negative feedback system works, which we'll talk about later. Just a little recap here. If we look at this basic cartoon drawing, we can see that we're looking at the hypothalamus up here, and this is where neuronal cell bodies will make releasing and inhibiting factors. So if we're talking about the release of a hormone, then we'll just be talking about releasing factors being made in the cell body. The hormone is stimulated to be released by these releasing factors passing down this neuron and being released into that endocrine tissue in the APG. And it will encourage the secretion of hormones such as adrenocorticotropic hormone, or whichever one specifically needs to be released. The anterior pituitary gland has endocrine tissue in it. So these endocrine cells, these two cells here, for example, will release these hormones or secrete them into the bloodstream where they will go to their target. All right, conversely, if we look at the posterior pituitary gland, we can see that straight away the anatomy is different here. We still have neurons in the hypothalamus which will communicate that information, but you can see that these nerve tracts are much longer, and they stem all the way through the infundibulum down to the lower portion of the posterior pituitary gland. If you contrast that with the anterior, you can see that these neurons are quite short, and this portion of the infundibulum is chiefly made up of blood vessels. So the posterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through nerves, as we can see here. And the posterior pituitary gland does not produce its own hormone. So this is a major difference between the APG and the PPG. Posterior does not produce hormones, it only secretes them. The hormones that it secretes are actually made in the hypothalamus. And the two that you need to know are ADH and oxytocin. Now, ADH, you learned about that in year 11 and its role in water reabsorption in the kidneys. The other name for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin, and that's mentioned in your textbook, and you may use those terms interchangeably, but if you're happy calling it antidiuretic hormone, that's fine. Now, what we really need to understand here is that in the posterior pituitary gland, hormones are manufactured in the cell body of the neurons up in the hypothalamus, and they are stored in the axon terminals down here in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so there is a nerve signal which is known as an action potential. That nerve signal will travel from the start of the axon right down to the end, and it will bring out the release of the desired hormone, be it oxytocin or ADH. Okay, again, another little summary. So cell bodies in the hypothalamus will manufacture one of two hormones to go to the PPG, ADH and oxytocin. Those hormones, will, each of them in turn, will travel down this long axon fiber. Again, this travels through the infundibulum, and it will eventually be released from the axon terminals. Now again, because it's a hormone, this hormone will travel in the bloodstream and go to its target organ or target cells. Okay, so this slide is just showing you how negative feedback works. So I'm just going to talk you through it very briefly. We can go over this again during another lesson. So we know that the hypothalamus contains neurosecretory cells, and it contains releasing and inhibiting factors. So this hypothalamus will secrete a releasing factor, and that will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete more ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this hormone specifically targets the adrenal cortex. So this is the part of the adrenal gland which lives on top of your kidneys. So by releasing factors from the hypothalamus, stimulating the anterior pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland will stimulate the adrenal cortex, which will then secrete more cortisol. Okay, so if we are under stress and we want to secrete more cortisol, this is the chain reaction that takes place in order to reach our end goal. Now, if we have too much cortisol in our body and our body detects this, then we have a negative feedback mechanism that can go one of two ways. First of all, we can prevent more releasing factor being released from the hypothalamus, or we can stop the anterior pituitary gland from telling the adrenal glands to release more cortisol via ACTH. But the point is, this is a negative feedback mechanism that controls the body and carefully makes sure that we don't have too much hormone floating around in our bloodstream. Okay, that's the end of this short lesson. Please make sure you go back and review your notes. There are two videos at the end of this PowerPoint, so this one here and one on the next slide. These will help you to understand how this all functions. If you need any further assistance, please get in touch with me.